Run number 1. Festina Lente. The fence is 8 feet high, with a keypad-operated lock door in its centre. It's fitted firmly against the wall on my left, and extends a couple of feet out over the water of the canal. I use my head torch to examine this barrier, since it is now fully pitch black on the towpath. It looks impenetrable and is by far the most significant fence I've faced. Somehow, however, if I'm going to be true to my mission, as it seems like I must, since otherwise why am I here, I have to get over it. I'm now beginning to regret my calculated act of trespass. 10 hours previously, on Friday 20th November 2020, I woke at 4:45 a.m, which is the sort of time I call farmer o'clock. I set my alarm for 5 a.m, but somehow my body seemed to know that it's vital I'm awake and able to face the challenges of the day, with plenty of time to eat a full breakfast, drink some coffee and still make my 6:10 tube train and 6:50 a.m. train to Leighton Buzzard. I stumble blearily into the shower and use hot water to force my eyes open. It's dark outside and not even the birds are up. 10 hours later I'm in the small, seemingly quite pretty Bedfordshire town of Leighton Buzzard, trotting down to the Union Canal beneath a glorious sunrise. I make a mental note to see more sunrises, then cross out that mental note, knowing myself too well. I am not a morning person. The first thing I see when I reach the towpath is a fellow runner, a young man striding off in the direction of London, although I assume that he probably won't make it that far. Only I am that crazed. The day is cold and clear. Layers of white cloud tinged salmon pink by the dawn don't seem threatening, so after the requisite start line photos, I set off in my fair weather gear, wearing one of the branded white caps I've left over from my first running adventure, my 2015 John O'Groats to Land's End run. I was 44 then, and I feel the intervening 6 additional years in my leaden legs as I negotiate slippery runnels of thick mud on the grassy towpath banks. Narrowboats are tied to their winter moorings in such abundance that I wonder if the realities of post-COVID-19 economics have forced a renaissance in boat dwelling. Certainly at 7:45 a.m, many of them have their lights on, indicating that for some of these people, at least, barge life is not a fair weather pursuit. As the morning wears on, I'll often hear the chug of oil-fired generators or run through the sweet-smelling fog of wood smoke issuing from the chimney stack of one of these floating homes. In terms of strategy for this, my first challenge, I only want to reach Brentford in West London, where the canal ends by 6 p.m. I'm having a Skype call birthday since the whole country is in lockdown at the moment, and in-person partying is out of the question. I need to be back home and presentable by 8 p.m, ideally. Sad to say, I've even bought 2 of the gold plastic inflatable number balloons so I can ironically celebrate my 50 years on the planet. Plus, sunset is due at 4 p.m, and I don't want to be running too many miles wearing my head torch, particularly on the remote, more industrial stretches of the Grand Union Canal. I can't say I'm feeling sprightly as I follow the canal's loops and straights under a still impressive and lingering sunrise. In truth, I feel fat and undertrained. I just hope that my reserves of resilience will hold up when things get brutal, as they are bound to once I hit the marathon wall, with 30 miles still to run. Although it's chilly, I'm not wearing my gloves. I know I'll want to take pictures along the way, and that's next to impossible with the gloves on, since the rubberized tips that are designed to help you use your smartphone have all but worn away. Taking the gloves off and putting them back on for every photo would quickly become irritating. I settle for mild discomfort and the ability to stop for a quick snap and move on. Fortunately, after 15 minutes my body has warmed up, the muscles have thawed out, and I've hit some sort of stride. I think I'm probably managing 9-minute miles, which is a shade too fast, while still shy of my normal long-distance pace. Having been running ultras for 6 years now, I know that pace yourself is an instruction I'll fail to take seriously, and to be honest, it doesn't seem to work for me. My best ever marathon time, 3:11:42, was obtained during a race where I threw sensible pacing out the window, running the first half in just under 83 minutes, then diminishing dramatically over the last 13 miles. My general attitude is, if it feels good to run fast, then run fast, which I'll admit will probably never lead to any race wins, but then I'm not really in it for that. Which begs the question, why exactly am I choosing to run 50 miles on my 50th birthday? It is, by all accounts, I have some very honest friends, a crazy way to celebrate such an occasion. Why would I want to experience the vast swathes of excruciating pain that I know are heading my way? Perhaps just to prove to myself that I still have it, whatever it is? If I'm to persevere with the constant struggle that is a meaningful and fulfilling life, then I need to do something regularly to prove to myself that I have the necessary staying power. This near double marathon should really kickstart my 51st year. It'll certainly be a birthday to remember. 5 miles out, I stopped to photograph a remarkably modernist concrete underpass, which has an almost Le Corbusier elegance, or perhaps I'm already delirious. I'm planning to stop for some sort of rest and refueling every 2 hours. I'll round off the hour and keep going until 10 a.m, making the first stage little more than a routine long run. At this early hour, I pass few people and no runners, the young man at Leighton evidently an outlier. I begin to enjoy myself, running without music and determined to persist without tunes until I really need their distraction. There's plenty to see, with enough yellow and ochre leaves on the trees to give the day an autumnal rather than wintry feel. After only 8 miles, I've spotted ducks, geese, moorhen, squirrels, cows, and even a small group of roe deer who bound away across a neighbouring field as I approach. If I wanted peace and solitude, the first part of my run offers plenty of both. I have a thing for lock keepers' cottages, and there are plenty of picturesque ones to admire and photograph. In reality, of course, such dwellings are probably plagued by damp, ill-suited to 21st century living, and often far from convenient roads. I still think I'd love to live in one, and as I've never seen one for sale, I suspect I'm not their only fan. The lock gates, many dating back to the late 19th century, are in remarkable condition, a testament to the golden age of Victorian engineering. They are all numbered, and I use their rising numbers to mark my progress as I run. The other useful indicators I keep an idle eye out for are the Bronsten Markers. When I start, these wrought iron bollards inform me that I'm 47 miles from the notable Northamptonshire junction where the Union Canal meets the Oxford Canal. I recall seeing these mile markers when I lived in Ealing and regularly trained along the southern reaches of this waterway. I think the last of them was 96 or 97 miles from Bronsten, which makes sense. I'll be able to keep track of my progress this way, which feels preferable to constantly consulting a running watch. I do have a Garmin GPS device in my backpack, happily ticking away the distance for posterity, although it only pings out positional signals every 2 minutes. It will no doubt cut off a fair few loops of the canal, so I can't really trust it for distance accuracy. Fortunately, I've already measured my route on mapmyrun.com and accounted for every contour. Just after 9 a.m, I pass 2 small reservoirs where ducks dabble as a pair of quantity surveyors set up their dumpy levels on the towpath. Somewhere to my right is Tring, the starting point of the first ultra I ever encountered, the 40 or 80 mile Tring to town. Discovering this race first got me into the notion of running further than a marathon distance. I remember being amazed that runners in their 40s and 50s could run 40 miles on a Saturday and then turn round and run the race again in reverse the following day. Somewhere around 9 a.m, I pass from Bedfordshire into Hertfordshire, the second of the 3 counties through which I'll run. There are no county markers on the towpath, and so the moment goes without recognition. After Tring, I realise I'll probably just make it to Berkhamsted in time for my first rest stop. I'm not slowing exactly, but my legs are feeling the extra effort after I hit the half-marathon distance. I previously run south from Berkhamsted, just once, whilst in training for my John O'Groats to Land's End. The town has bittersweet connotations. Exceedingly pretty, with a convoluted history dating back 5,000 years, the village was once the site of the Anglo-Saxon surrender to William the Conqueror, following the Battle of Hastings. Berkhamsted was also the site of a pub brawl I managed to get myself embroiled in as a well-meaning bystander between a lagered-up rugby fan whose team had just lost and 2 young American hipsters. Unfortunately, this particular cultural combination resulted in a bloody nose for the young Yank, as I and several other customers attempted to pull the bruiser off his victim. I learned 2 valuable lessons from this encounter. Firstly, some people take games of pool far too seriously. Secondly, never drink in a railway pub with sticky carpets. I reach the outskirts of the village by 10:15 and am grateful to sit on one of the arms of a lock gate and consume some flavourless lentil crisps and a nutty granola bar. I rarely find I can eat much during a long run, but given that I'll be burning around 7,000 calories, I'll definitely have to attempt some refueling. As well as the dry carbs, I've brought a bottle of Lucozade Sport and half a dozen glutinous glucose gels. Hardly a sumptuous birthday treat, but palatable in a crisis. I set off 15 minutes later and immediately feel the shock of traumatised muscles. It's as if my body thinks it's stopping for the day and has moved straight into rest and recuperation mode. I find it's tricky to manage more than jogging pace to begin with, as I distract myself by imagining how lovely it will be post-COVID to have a pint in one of the many canal-side pubs I pass. One good thing about the pandemic is that it minimises fear of missing out. Nobody will be sitting enjoying a drink while I labour past them, not for a few months at least. While I wait for my legs to catch up with my ambitions, I pass more brightly painted and imaginatively named narrowboats. Alter Ego, Artful Dodger, Baltic, Sarah Rosie, and my personal favourite, Festina Lente. The Latin translates roughly as hurry slowly, and could be my personal ultra-running motto. It's also the title of one of my favourite tunes by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, a gloriously melancholy piece in which a melody is played by 3 different groups of string instruments at different speeds, falling in and out of sync with one another, leaving moments of near silence and passages of shimmering glissando. I do feel a little melancholy being alone on my birthday, but I have only one pace modulation, and it's getting slower by increments. I'm distracted by the incongruous sight of a totem pole, which turns out to be a genuine Quarcuti carving gifted by the Canadian people to a local timber yard owner. My attention is similarly diverted by the 3 Horseshoes pub, which goes straight into first place for canal-side pubs in the competition I'm running in my head. My feeble pace is not helped when a ponytailed blonde hurtles past me at furious pace, or so it seems to me as I shamble along at 12-minute mile pace. I really ought to have trained. I'm seeing more and more runners now as the towns and villages become larger and more extensive. We're in prime London commuter belt territory, and I'll hit Apsley soon, where a good friend once lived in a redeveloped narrowboat marina. Sensibly, she dwelt in a 1-bed flat rather than a barge. More than one drunken evening was spent looking down from Tracy's balcony and people watching as runners, cyclists and dog walkers passed by. The canal skirts Hemel Hempstead without making much contact with it, perhaps a blessing. A little after that I reached King's Langley, a place I can't help hearing as King's Landing, being a Game of Thrones fan. There are no treacheries and intrigues here, however, just the impressive Art Deco Ovaltine factory, now converted to flats, and the remains of a Roman villa, the settlement being on the outskirts of St Albans' Roman town, Verulamium. I considered stopping at King's Langley, but I'm worried that my legs will seize up and I'll be reduced to walking the second half of my ultra. I decide to continue until 12:30 p.m. and hopefully find somewhere with a bench to take my lunch. In the end, I ran out of steam at Hunton Bridge, having first passed under that symbolic landmark, the M25. I'm now in the Greater London area, although that doesn't comfort me much with almost 24 miles left to run. As if by magic, I've stopped an exact marathon away from Leighton Buzzard, and I feel every bit like a man who's just run 26.2 miles on insufficient training. I force down a couple of granola bars and some Lucozade and press on before rigor mortis sets in. A little light drizzle begins to drift in, but as a Scotsman used to things being dreich, I declare it not serious rain and forge on. As things become more worrying and more painful, I try to remind myself why I'm doing this. To slip momentarily into melodrama, I'm really trying to prove that I've got this aging process under control, rather than the other way around. I'm not just going to give in to middle age and become a disappointed slob. I'm going to fight and struggle to stay healthy, fit and adventurous. Perhaps I'll even be able to find a lasting happiness along the way. That's quite a lot to ask of a 50-mile yomp, but I'm seeing this symbolic first run of my 50s as a kickstart to this principle of fighting back. The sky has greyed over and the rain is a little heavier now. There seems to be no possibility of achieving a decent pace as runners continually pass me. I realise I have less than 3 hours of sunlight remaining. If I could just reach the section of the canal I'm most familiar with, south from Uxbridge, then getting out the head torch for the last chunk won't be too bad. My speed, although dead slow, is still faster than my walk, so I keep it up. As long as I can still overtake a chugging narrowboat, then I'm doing okay. A couple of times during the run I get the opportunity to test this principle as a few hardy souls are out and about in their vessels, negotiating the locks, heading towards or away from London. I stop to photograph an unusually ornamental bridge finished in a pale yellowish whitewash. This turns out to be the canal side entrance to the Grove, an estate belonging to a grand Georgian mansion, now converted into a luxury hotel. The Grove sometimes hosts international political conferences, including the G20 Summit in 2009 and the 2019 NATO Leaders Meeting. The great thing about a canal run is the lack of elevation change. It's easy to maintain an even pace if you're not constantly battling hills. Unfortunately, this is also one of the disadvantages of a canal run. The monotony of endless loops of flat towpath can be wearing. However, there's enough beauty and surprise on this stretch of the route to keep me pleasantly distracted. Soon I pass the converted remains of the 18th century Grove Mill with its distinctive yellow London stock brickwork. The 4-storey structure once milled corn, now of course it's apartments. Beyond lies an exceptionally pretty stretch of gently looping canal, passing through the Grove's grounds and then Castleberry Park, a 190-acre reserve created from the dissolution and sale of the Earl of Essex's estate. As well as the lovely distraction of the remaining late autumn leaves, which are a rich yellow and ochre hue, the park provides enough cover for a much-needed and surreptitious pee. I pass a floating coffee shop and am tempted to stop for one, but the darkening sky drives me on. Soon a sign informs me that I'm a mile from Rickmansworth, about which I know little, except that one of my favourite cult authors, Douglas Adams, used it as the location of a revelatory moment for one young woman who, inspired by the example of Jesus, has an epiphany in a small cafe about how the world could be made a good and happy place. Unfortunately, before Fenchurch can put her plan into action, the Earth is destroyed to make way for a hyperspace bypass. More optimistically, the sign also informs me that I am somehow just 7 miles from London. I assume this means from the outskirts of Greater London or Uxbridge, and don't allow myself to get too excited, since I'll then still have 11 miles further to reach Brentford and my final destination. Narrowboat moorings proliferate on the next stretch. I admire their owners' ingenuity and pass several 20-somethings beavering away on DIY projects, replacing doors, sanding down decking or painting their hulls. This being a Friday, it's quite likely a lot of these people are furloughed from their jobs, or worse. Or maybe they're just itinerant writer-directors like me, scratching out a living from dreams and tall stories. The bushes are decorated with lanterns and bird feeders, and some of the narrowboats have even co-opted small bits of towpath to use as outdoor seating areas or bicycle stores, which nobody seems to object to. Having lived for 5 months in a self-converted camper van, I can see much to envy in this lifestyle, even though I prefer the possibility of a speedy exit from any ill-chosen camping spot that Roxy, the Mazda Bongo, makes possible. The canal now passes through a nature reserve, including the Springwell reed bed, whose signs inform me the largest reed bed in the London area. If I were knowledgeable in such things, I'd probably recognise the call of the reed warbler, which dwell here in large numbers. Bats are a common sight at night, skimming the reeds for a midnight snack of moths. Were I here just an hour or so later, I might, if lucky, witness the murmuration of starlings throwing their morphing patterns across the evening sky. The afternoon grows darker, danker, and quieter as I crawl gratefully into Uxbridge, seeing the familiar curving concrete facade of the Par Excel building, the local office of a pharmaceutical company specialising in clinical trials. I have a dim and distant memory of once applying to take part in a patch trial for some drug through Par Excel, but not getting beyond the initial screening process due to potential liver damage I'd suffered in my 20s. Exhausted, I stop by a bench and decide not to have a proper rest in case my leg seize up completely. It's considerably colder now that the sun has evidently gone down quite unceremoniously. I'm shivering a little and know that I must move on soon. I put on my running gloves and a thick waterproof jacket and pull up the hood. Then I put my running cap over the hood and attach my head torch for later. I've probably got about 30 minutes of twilight and early dusk left to make do without the torch. My phone is down to 10% power, so I plug it into a portable charger. I've only been using it for occasional music, which I resorted to over the preceding 8 miles, and for photos, which I'm uploading to Facebook at each rest point. While I've been running, the occasional buzz of a text or message has registered on my upper arm, where I keep the holster that holds my phone. I can't answer any of them, and just hope enough people know what I'm doing and don't assume I'm being rude by ignoring them. I tear open a bag of Haribo Tang Fastics, the delicious but insanely sugary sweets that seem to work almost as effectively as my glucose gels. These at least have the benefit of tasting half decent as I chew them down. A few swigs of Lucozade and I'm off. I'll admit that my diet is fairly dreadful during these long runs. I'm no Rich Roll or Scott Jurek, vegan ultra runners. As I pass through Uxbridge, it's almost weird to see city folk again, as well as red London buses and a few Christmas lights the town has strung along its iconic semicircular bridge. I begin to feel a slight dread of encountering a gang of youths who might find it amusing to scare me or push me into the canal, but nothing of that nature happens. If anything, I'm the scary apparition lurching down the gloomy towpath, moving with all the pace and elan of a zombie. After a while my shuffle becomes a walk, with, I realise, no loss of pace. I hope I'll be able to run again before the end of the journey, but for now a brisk walk is enough to maintain some semblance of progress. The familiar Bronsten mile markers are now in their mid-80s. I feel like I'm also in my mid-80s, unfortunately. At a couple of points earlier in the run, I hit sections of towpath which were supposedly closed to pedestrians. I confess I didn't take these very seriously, seeing no sign of improvement work in process. There's no way of knowing when these temporary barriers were erected, and they show all the signs of being regularly ignored by locals. There are always ways to squeeze by, and these barriers never pose any real impediment to forward progress. Half an hour into my final session, I hit something more dramatic. 3 sections of metal barricade 8 feet high and extending up the wooded bank to my left and out into the canal on the other side. It's now 4 p.m. and the sky is pitch black. I have no idea what alternative route to take if I can't run on the towpath. To lose this route would be a great shame. For the last 3 miles I've been skimming along hard-packed gravelly tarmac, which has been great to run on. I'll weigh up the pros and cons of one more act of trespass. Top of the cons list is the possible embarrassment of encountering workmen, which seems unlikely. It's pitch black out now. There's also the possibility of hitting a barrier that's truly insurmountable and being forced to deviate in the middle of nowhere, perhaps somewhere where there aren't even runnable roads. I find myself climbing the bank and edging around the last section of fencing. Minutes later, the freshly laid tarmac, hemmed in by wooden siding, gives way to gravel, and I see sections of half-buried pipe in a thin ditch to my left. This must be a combined cable lay and restoration project. I begin to feel mildly guilty. Whereas my previous trespasses threw up no evidence of work of any kind, here I am leaving footprints in someone's project. Fortunately, it's gravel underfoot rather than wet concrete, and there's no sign of anyone around. If this was a live site, I'd see working lights in the distance, so I keep an eye out. For the next 40 minutes I encounter nothing but inky darkness and a part-complete surface that's easier to run on than mud or grass. I'm quite enjoying this certainty that I won't pass anyone at all on this stretch, and I'm looking out for the familiar landmarks that I once used to mark off the miles on the semi-regular training route. Where are the 2 black sheds that seem to have no purpose but to look scary? Where is the Nestle factory? Where is the small packaging plant with the back door that workers emerge from to smoke? There's absolutely no light other than my head torch and the occasional bit of illumination from warehouses or local branch stations on the opposite bank. I have to look down frequently to make sure I don't trip over the mooring ropes of industrial barges or patches of unworked ground. I'm delighted to find I suddenly have the ability to run again, neither fast nor gracefully, but maintaining around a 12-minute mile pace somehow. Then, inevitably, I reach the wooden fence described at the head of this chapter. Oops, I think. Have I finally met my match? There's nothing for it but to be brave and resourceful. Grimacing with the effort, I use the horizontal joists behind the barrier to climb it, then dreep down the other side. I drop the last foot onto shaky legs, then rejoice internally. Once again, I'm getting away with it. I'm now in familiar territory as I run through Useley and West Drayton, dodging puddles where possible, but not really caring if I splash through mud now and again. I'm sure the soles of my feet are wrecked, but I'm only in regular torment, not unbearable agony. I have shin splints to deal with, dull pain flashing up my right ankle, where I have a tiny bone deformity that rubs against the tissues. It's all endurable, with the finish line now 6 or 7 miles away. The last section is a spooky trip down memory lane. I've not run this section after dark, and I'm glad that it's a cold, rainy evening and I don't have to startle too many unfortunates out on the towpath. I pass labourers returning home from work and cyclists weaving between the puddles, plus the occasional dog walker. I count down the landmarks, the humpback bridge, the overpass, the Toys R Us outlet. A treacherous thought begins to form itself, encouraged by my exhaustion. I could stop at Althorne Park. I could duck up those stairs and then run straight to the underground station at Boston Manor. My watch tells me it's 6:30 p.m. and I'm supposed to be on my birthday Skype call soon. Showered, fed and rested in 90 minutes. None of that seems likely to happen if I run all the way to Brentford. For now I dismiss the thought and keep ticking off whatever familiar sights I can make out in the gloom. After what seems like a frustrating age of negotiating an endlessly muddy and rutted section near Southall, I reach the Three Bridges junction at Hanwell, where a road passes over a canal, as it in turn surmounts the railway. The easily overlooked but impressive intersection was actually the last commission of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who died just 2 months after its completion in 1859. A 10-minute walk away, Brunel fans can also catch one of his first achievements, the Warncliffe Viaduct, which carries the Great Western Railway across the River Brent. I passed the old asylum site, which still houses the West London Mental Health Trust, then one of my favourite lockkeeper's cottages on the opposite bank, which comes with a large garden and boat dock. I'm just minutes from a possible exit via the Elthorn Park steps, and yet when I get there, still shuffling along at a slow jog, I keep going. As I commit to the last mile and a half, I have that strange displaced feeling of observing my decisions rather than being the author of them. There's a rather desolate significance to this route now, and one that still frightens me. On 28th of August 2014, when I lived a few streets away, a 14-year-old, Alice Gross, went missing on her way to school whilst walking the same route I am now running. I remember the missing persons posters and then the yellow ribbons tied to trees after her body was found in the Brent River 6 weeks later. The very next day, the corpse of her murderer, Arnis Salkans, a Latvian builder who had previously spent 7 years in prison for murdering his wife, was discovered hanging from a tree in nearby Boston Manor Park. It's likely he killed himself shortly after committing the crime. My surroundings bring back gloomy memories of the mood of shock and sadness that passed through the local community in the weeks following the deaths. In most murders, there's someone to theoretically punish, even if they are never caught. In this tragic case, Alice's family were denied even that relief, since Salkans took that task upon himself. I try to think of happier things as I complete my run, how good it will be to see my friends on Skype later on, the remarkable fact of my achievement. As I round the last bend at 7:18 p.m. and pass under the ramshackle old warehouse roof that still inexplicably covers part of the Brentford Marina, I begin to feel the familiar rush of relief. I've completed a remarkable challenge I'd set for myself for somewhat inscrutable reasons. It's a small triumph, significant only to me, and there's nobody waiting at Brentford to share it with. Nevertheless, it feels important. A flag in the ground, a declaration of my ownership of a hopefully remarkable 51st year to come. Roll on 2021. Distance covered, 50 miles. Time, 11 hours, 31 minutes. Average pace, 4.5 miles an hour. Difficulty rating, 8 out of 10. So thanks for that. Thanks for listening if you've made it all the way to the end. It's a bit of an epic, that first chapter. Most of them are a bit shorter, but I went into quite a lot of detail. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking for a publisher, and fingers crossed the book will be out either later this year or early 2023. And I will see you again with a piece of fiction very soon. Goodbye.